Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for the Pride Study Wrapped, our research year in review 2025. We are so excited to bring back this annual webinar series for the second time this year. And we are going to be today looking at some really impactful research that was published in 2025 from the Pride Study. Uh, Before we get started, wanted to give some introductions on the team who is helping to facilitate the webinar. So I am Daniel Moretti. I use any pronouns with positive intent. I am Program Management Director with the Pride Study and Pride Net. And for a brief visual description, I have light brown skin, brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a very frilly black shirt with a gold necklace. And I'll hand it over to my colleague Elle to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Daniel. Hi, everyone. My name is Elle. I use he and they pronouns. I am a coordinator for the Pride Study. Brief description of me. I have ashy blonde hair, short hair. I have a beard. I'm white. I'm wearing a tan button up. Yeah, and I'm going to be helping with moderating and facilitating and doing some tech stuff. So glad to be here and to hear from all the researchers.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Elle. And thanks so much for helping us to keep the webinar running smoothly. So before we dive into the presentation today, I'm just going to give a little bit of introductions and some housekeeping. So you might be familiar. We are having this as a Zoom webinar. So for the chat, you could utilize that if you want to send a message to the hosts and presenters. If you want to ask a question to have one of the presenters answer, you can use the Q&A feature on your screen. Um, and if it's not showing up for you, if you click on there's kind of three little breadcrumb dots. If you click on more, it might be under there, the Q&A feature. And then lastly, you can turn on the transcript as well as the captions. So those buttons are on your screen as well. The other thing I wanted to mention is that if you use the Q&A function, then you can also ask questions anonymously. You'll see on the little dialog box, there's a checkbox for send anonymously. But if you don't mind your name being associated with your question, feel free to also use the chat box. And Elle will be helping us to take a look through those as well. So the agenda for today, once I stop talking with the welcoming remarks, I will be able to bring up our first presenter, Dr. Briana Last, who's going to be talking about multiple studies related to anti-LGBTQ state policies and LGBTQIA plus adults' mental health. Then we'll go ahead and welcome Dr. David Knitz, who is going to talk about how stress and unequal treatment relate to employment among LGBTQIA plus workers. And then we'll close out with Dr. Nick Matheny, who is going to be talking about experiencing intimate partner violence and how it's associated with future substance use in LGBTQ people. And then make sure to stay tuned for the end. We'll have some closing remarks and opportunity to connect as well. I also wanted to make sure that everyone was aware that this is day one of a three-day webinar series extravaganza. So you'll be able to hear on this Thursday and Friday additional researchers that are sharing their studies, their findings from the Pride study. Elle, if you don't mind posting the chat, I think it needs to just be sent to everyone as opposed to hosts and panelists. So you'll be able to see in the chat the link to register for the Pride Study Wrapped if you're not already set for our day 2 and day 3, which you definitely do not want to miss. And then I do want to give a quick content notice. So some of the studies that are being presented may include sharing data around experiences of trauma, violence, discrimination, and/or substance use. Please practice self-care. If you need to take a break from the webinar, we'll be recording, so we'll be sharing things later. Or if at any time you need to leave, we completely understand. Please, everyone, let's take care of each other and ourselves. Also, we have the slides available thanks to the generosity of our presenters. They are available at this QR code if you want to zap it on your phone, or Elle has already put the link in the chat where you can download all of the slides from today's presentations. I wanted to give a little bit of context and backstory around the organizations that are hosting today's webinar. So first, I'm going to start with the PrideNet. So PrideNet, we're a community engagement network that catalyzes LGBTQIA plus health research. So we really focus on ways to connect LGBTQI plus community members with ways to participate in trusted research and participating in a meaningful way. And we also are focusing on creating opportunities for community input to inform all stages of the research process. So a huge shout out to everyone that makes up the Pride Net network, our community partner consortium, many individuals that I see on the call, our participant advisory committee, and our ambassadors. Thank you so much to everyone that makes the work possible. Elle has also dropped in the chat a link where you can learn more about PrideNet and what we do on our website. And then some background around the Pride study in case you're not already a participant or it's new or looking for a refresher. We're based here at a Stanford University School of Medicine, and we're really proud that we're the first national online and long-term health study of LGBTQIA plus physical, mental, and social health. And we've been having longitudinal data collection since 2017. So as we're moving into our annual questionnaire this year, we're going to be marking our 10th annual questionnaire and 10 years of longitudinal data collection. I think that's particularly special to note, knowing the attacks that have been last year and ongoing this year for LGBTQIA plus health research. And we could not do it without our amazing partners and participants like you who have all joined us and our communities that are coming together to make this work possible. Really also want to emphasize that we are created by us and for us. So LGBTQI plus providers and researchers who are, as you'll meet on the call, as well as our creators and our co-directors, and it's made for our LGBTQIA plus communities. And participation, the main core item is an annual survey that's about 45 minutes. And eligibility is anyone who's a sexual gender minority or LGBTQI plus, 18 years or older in the US or territories and comfortable reading and understanding English. So I know I've talked a bit about what we are, Pride Study, and it's coming from my lens. Wanted to also lift up the voice of a participant who shares their own story about what it means to participate in the Pride Study.
I am a Pride Study participant. Hi, my name is Gabriela Guerra. I use she, her pronouns. I graduated from Stanford in 2019 with my degree in psychology, and I'm currently based outside of Durham, North Carolina by way of Ypsilanti, Michigan. My partner and I met at Stanford, so it's contributed in many ways to my current life in this very moment. I identify as Mexican American. I identify as bisexual. I'm a photographer, a lifelong musician. I'm a DJ, community organizer, a writer. I know that there's a lot of medical mistrust and mistrust of the research community for good reason, because we haven't been treated very well historically. And I think that's what makes the Pride Study so important, is that it's by our community, for our community, making sure that we are safe and healthy. As someone that does live in a more rural environment and in a community that's often excluded, I think it's important that we have members of our community involved in these studies. I want to make sure that I can contribute my experience to research that is going to support other people like me now and in the future. And I really want to encourage other people that feel like they haven't been included in past research to consider joining the Pride Study as well.
Well, very always inspired when I get to hear from participants and especially Gabby's sharing her story. So again, huge thanks to all of our participants that make this work possible. All right, without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and do a very warm welcome and introduction to Dr. Briana Last. Dr. Briana Last is an assistant professor in the psychology department at Stony Brook University. They are a clinical psychologist and mental health services and policy researcher. Really excited to go ahead and welcome to the virtual stage, Dr. Briana Last.
Thanks so much, Danielle. It's an honor to be here, and thanks to everyone who's attending. So just for visual information, I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a denim shirt with butterflies embroidered on it. I'm going to share my screen and would love some just visual or vocal confirmation that everyone can see it.
Sure can.
Looks great.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. So I'm really excited to be presenting on two research studies that I did in partnership with the Pride study. And both of them center on the policy environment that Daniel mentioned, which is the sort of rise of anti-LGBTQIA state policies and the mental health implications of these policies. So the first study I'm going to be presenting is a quantitative study, and the second study is going to be a qualitative study. And just want to share funders and disclosures. So much of this work is indebted to federal funding, which feels especially important to just mention in light of the current environment that this work required lots of support, both institutional and federal. And also just want to mention in terms of disclosures that I was a technical working group member for a project that was looking at how to improve the lives of underserved children and families. So in terms of the learning objectives for today, the first is just to identify how the recent wave of policies restricting the rights of LGBTQIA people has been associated with worse well-being among LGBTQIA people. And then I also want to bring forward and amplify some of the voices and perspectives of LGBTQIA people themselves. So how are they experiencing this new policy environment and perceiving the impacts? So I'm going to start with a brief kind of introduction to the policy context, which some of us are all sort of just living in right now, and then provide some information on the studies themselves. So as many of you are familiar, the policy landscape for LGBTQIA people has, really changed in the last several years. So there has been a rise in US state policies restricting the healthcare access and civil rights of LGBTQIA people. More recently, there's been a rise in federal policies that have also restricted the rights of LGBTQIA people as well. Many of these policies have targeted transgender and non-binary people. So just a couple of policy examples. So gender-affirming care bans are bans on best practices in gender transition-related medical care for transgender and non-binary people, as well as bans on transgender and non-binary people participating in sports in high school through college, as well as bathroom bans, so prohibitions on transgender and non-binary people using bathrooms that match their gender identity. And it's just important to note that the rise of these policies has really been kind of accelerated in the past several years. So before 2021, no state had passed a law banning gender-affirming care for transgender and non-binary youth. But as of today, over half of the US states now restrict these practices, and the Supreme Court has endorsed the constitutionality of these bans. And just to demonstrate this in a kind of powerful figure that was collected by and developed by Trans Legislation Tracker, each year has essentially beat the last year's record for the most anti-transgender legislation in American history. So this environment has really really changed over the past several years. And I wanted to really do a deep dive to understand how these policies are impacting the mental health of LGBTQIA people. And so, in collaboration with the Pride study, we conducted a study examining the associations with these anti-transgender policies. And so we looked at the associations between state level anti-transgender policies and the mental health symptoms of LGBTQIA adults more broadly and transgender and non-binary adults specifically. And as Daniel really helpfully showed earlier, we leveraged the annual survey data from the Pride study. Um, uh, this slide has already been presented in its own form, but just as a reminder that there are over 30,000 participants in the Pride study, and we were looking at the data that's collected on an annual basis. And we were looking at the association between these three policies in particular. So gender affirming care bans, sports bans, and bathroom bans, and these mental health symptoms. So anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms as measured by validated measures that are collected annually within the Pride study. And we used a difference in differences approach, which I'll provide a really brief explainer of momentarily. And we looked at whether or not living in a state with one or more of these policies was associated with increases in anxiety, depression, or post-traumatic stress disorder among LGBTQIA people. And just to give you a sense of what a difference in differences analysis is, so it's a technique that's been originated in the field of econometrics. And it's typically used to estimate the effect of an intervention or policy by comparing the changes in outcomes over time between a group of people that is exposed to the policy, so the kind of intervention group, and a population or group that's not affected by the policy. And those people are considered the control group. So if you live in a state without that policy, you're in the control group. And so the difference in differences approach is a really useful technique when you can't or it's unethical to randomize people, but you want to look at the so-called kind of intervention effect. And so this figure is a kind of display of how you estimate that intervention effect for a difference in differences approach. So in terms of the results, our final sample included 8,733 participants from 44 states and the District of Columbia. And it may be a little bit hard to see in your screens, but the figure here displays symptoms of anxiety, depression, and PTSD among the total sample of LGBTQIA participants in the Pride study, as well as the subsample of participants in the Pride study that identify as transgender and non-binary. And this is before and after state level enactment. So as you can kind of see, just kind of by looking at the figure, perhaps unsurprising to those looking, among the trans and non-binary participants, we're seeing high overall symptoms of anxiety, depression, and PTSD in this sample. In fact, all of these kind of lines are at or just above the kind of clinical threshold. So even before the implementation of these policies and the enactment of these policies, we're seeing kind of high symptoms among the trans and non-binary individuals in our sample. And what we found when we did the difference in differences analysis was that among the kind of broader sample, among LGBTQIA participants more broadly, there were increases in anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms that were statistically significant after policy enactment for individuals living in states that had passed those policies. Interestingly, we didn't see this among the trans and non-binary participants, but as I suggested earlier, actually before these policies, there were already really high symptoms among that group. And so in terms of just the primary findings of this study, what I found was that anti-transgender policies were associated with increases in anxiety and post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms among LGBTQIA participants across the US. And for the transgender and non-binary participants in the study, they experienced smaller, non-significant increases in mental health symptoms. But just important to note that caveat that trans and non-binary participants, their mental health symptoms were high, so above or at clinical cutoffs on nearly all symptom measures at all study time points. So we're seeing this kind of high burden of mental health challenges among trans and non-binary people. And here's a QR code to the study if you want to read it in full. So after doing this study, I had a couple of questions that I really wanted to follow up on, given these kind of counterintuitive findings, or at least, findings that merited further investigation. The first was, is enactment of these recent policies the best metric of exposure to stress? So, as I said, before even the implementation or enactment of these policies, we're seeing kind of high symptoms among trans and non-binary people, which to me suggested that they're already experiencing significant stress, in their environments. And so maybe just the anticipation of these policies could be stressful and distressing in and of itself. And so I just wanted to get a better sense from people themselves, what was going on in their lives, and to understand the kind of the lived experience of people before, getting to get a better grasp of what was going on. And second, we also only looked at 3 policies. And as all of you are probably familiar, there were lots of policies that were being enacted and implemented during this time period and even before the policy period under study. So as Daniel mentioned, the Pride study started collecting data in 2017. But as one of the figures that I showed you earlier suggested, there were also some anti-transgender policies that were being enacted, as early as 2015. So, there are lots of policies that need to be kind of considered that may have even preceded kind of the ability for us to understand that quantitatively. So I decided to do a follow-up qualitative study to really talk to LGBTQIA people themselves to understand their perspectives on the policy environment they were living in. And so before I, tell you about that qualitative study and tell you how I tried to answer some of my unanswered questions, I first just wanted to pause and hear from all of you about what your questions are about the first study I presented.
Thank you so much, Briana, and just want to echo your invitation. Attendees, please feel free, type in the chat, use the Q&A function, however you would like to raise any questions that you have about the study, and also there'll be opportunities for the second study that Briana will be presenting. I'll go ahead and I do have a question on my end. I think this is, just such a timely and important study. And there's, I think, just so many layers of potential impacts that policies, whether they're enacted or not, can have. In doing the quantitative component of the study, was there anything in terms of the findings or through the process of writing the manuscript and the analysis? Was there anything that was maybe surprising to you or that was unexpected as you were looking at the data?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think it was really revealing to see that kind of high symptom threshold even before the enactment of these policies among so many folks in the sample. So I think there's, real mental health need across the board, and that was sort of what led me to want to do this qual study and really talk to people, was realizing, oh, wow, like this is just kind of scratching beneath the surface of, probably much broader structural stigma and minority stress that, just kind of the enactment of a policy may not even be able to get at.
Thanks so much. I think that's just really what you're sharing resonates with me and something that I think really stood out as you're sharing the data. Okay, great. We have a question from Greta. Was this study longitudinal or cross-sectional? In other words, is this looking at the same participants over time?
Yeah, great question. So we used repeated cross-sectional data from the Pride study. So because we didn't have enough longitudinal data over the entire study period. So we were looking at basically like all of the Pride study data up until I think 2022. And so we just didn't have enough longitudinal data from like the same participant over that entire study time period. So it was repeated cross-sectional.
Thank you so much. We have another audience question. Did you find any differences in mental health impact between L, G, and B people?
Oh, that's a really good question. We didn't actually look at that. So I don't know the answer to that question.
Thanks so much. I know there's so much to look at, and I know you have such an amazing body of work, so possibly more to come in future studies. We have a question in the chat. Did you see a lot of movers who relocated from policy enactment states?
That is such a good question. And that is a perfect setup for a study that is actually under review right now, where we looked at some of the moving among Pride study participants. And so we looked the study that's under review is looking at kind of people's intentions and decisions to move after the 2024 election. Um, and hopefully I'll be able to come to another Pride study unwrapped and share some of the findings there. But we did see very large intentions to move after the 2024 election. And a significant minority of Pride study participants also did actually move after the election.
Yeah, thanks so much for that little sneak peek and just a gentle reminder. If you want to hear when that gets published, make sure you sign up for PrideNet newsletter. And thanks for the amazing work that you're doing on that study and so many others. Okay, our last question before I let us move on to hear more about your qualitative work. The question comes from the Q&A and it says, are there any other mediators of mental health to consider alongside the policy enactment you would have liked to have looked at if you could?
It's such a good question. One of the things that we're all sort of living through now too, right, is the fact that just because you live in a state that doesn't have the policy in place doesn't mean that there haven't been sort of chilling effects or kind of voluntary um, sort of efforts by the state to no longer provide care. And so I think implementation and policy implementation is such an important area to investigate, which is sort of like what's actually happening on the ground. So we know this policy is on the books, or we know this policy is not on the books technically, but how is access to care actually realized within a state? How is it actually lived and enforced and regulated within a state? Those are all like really important questions that requires actually just sort of getting on the ground and I think talking to people and really hearing from people's experiences to understand how that stuff gets lived.
Great. Well, thank you again so much. And there'll be opportunities to answer more questions after the second study. So I'll go ahead and pass it back to you, Brianna, to share more about the qualitative study.
Yeah, thanks for all those great questions, everyone. So yeah, I think actually that last comment really relates to some of the questions that I had about how is this actually being experienced by LGBTQIA people themselves? And so this next study really is trying to get that experience firsthand by talking to Pride study participants in states that either have these policies or don't yet have these policies. So for this study, I really wanted to understand the perspectives of LGBTQIA adults living in states that recently introduced or passed anti-LGBTQIA policies. So this is a slight kind of extension of the past study because the past study just looked at people living in states that either passed or didn't pass a policy. But for this study, I also wanted to see, is the mere threat, right, is the introduction at the state legislative level, is that going to, potentially induce anticipatory anxiety or stress among individuals in those states? And wanted to sort of talk to people firsthand to understand the mental health impacts of these policies. And so we called this study Project LEAP. And we interviewed Pride study participants between July and October 2024. So our study kind of ended at the tail end of October, right before the election. So that was a really interesting time to sort of be talking to people. And we conducted 60-minute Zoom interviews with Pride Study participants. And the policies under study were all the policies that we studied in the first quantitative study, but we also expanded it to education curricular laws. So what are often known as kind of don't say gay laws. So laws that kind of prohibit discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity in schools, as well as religious exemption policies. So policies that allow religious or faith-based providers to deny services to LGBTQIA people on the basis of their identity. And we used a purposeful sampling approach. So everyone who participated in our study had completed a 2023 annual survey, but we purposefully sampled participants from states that either had passed all of the policies I just mentioned under study, had passed some of those policies under study, or had introduced but did not pass any of the policies under study. So, some bill was sort of passing through the state legislature at the time that we were doing this interview. And we also ensured using a kind of random sampling approach to ensure that around half of our sample identified as people of color and half as transgender and non-binary. And generally speaking, these interviews were semi-structured and about an hour long. And we asked people about their awareness of these state policies. We asked them about the impacts of these policies on their own lives, as well as the lives of those close to them. We also asked them how they were responding to the policy. So how are you coping? How are you sort of engaging in advocacy? As well as their desired multi-level supports and interventions. And to analyze the data, we use thematic analysis, which basically just sort of organizes the interviews into themes. And it's an iterative approach where we were reading the interview data, listening to the interviews, coding the data for shared themes or meanings, developing themes, and then kind of doing that approach iteratively. And so just in terms of kind of who we spoke to, I'm going to share a little bit about the participant characteristics. So we talked to 61 people in the study, and we achieved our goal of having about half of our participants identify as trans and non-binary, as well as people of color. We had a nice kind of range of education level. Our sample skewed to be less employed, and around median age of 35 years old. Just to give you a map of sort of where participants lived. So it may be a little bit hard for you to see, just given how small the text is, apologies. But green is basically states that neither introduced nor passed any policies, so we didn't interview anyone from there. Blue represents states that had introduced but not passed any policies, and that makes sense based on the states here. Yellow represents states that passed some policies, but not all the policies under study. And then red were states that passed all the policies. And then that kind of slash mark is where participants actually lived. So as you can see, we primarily talked to a lot of people, pretty much every state that had passed all the policies. We had participants from those states, as well as from states where some policies were passed. So I'm going to start with the kind of big picture themes, and then I'm going to zoom into the mental health themes. So in terms of our big picture themes, we actually heard some really interesting kind of tensions, really suggesting the kind of diversity of LGBTQIA people in the country, as well as the diversity of their experiences. So we sort of heard three main tensions. The first tension was these policies negatively impact us all, and at the same time, some people are impacted more than others. Another tension that we heard was we're living in this really bad political moment, and at the same time, life wasn't easy before these policies. And the third tension was, despite these policies, we still have hope and support. We're still resilient. And at the same time, we need more support and we need more protection. So those were, the kind of array of themes that we heard across interviews. And I'm going to focus today on some of the mental health, well-being, themes. So that kind of first tension. So that's this, zooming in. So zooming in terms of the kind of negative impacts of these policies, particularly the mental health impacts, we heard participants talk about the kind of chronic worry, stress, and hypervigilance they experience, so the kind of attentiveness to threats in the wake of these policies, as well as social isolation and feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness. At the same time, participants acknowledge that, some people are being impacted more than others. So trans and non-binary people and youth are being most targeted. Social and economic inequality is exacerbating the impacts of these policies, and rural communities are most affected. And nothing is more powerful than just sort of hearing some of the quotes. So I'm going to share some quotes from each of these themes. So in terms of the chronic stress, worry, and hypervigilance theme, we heard some people say just how worried they feel basically all the time when they're kind of leaving their house and kind of going out into the world among people that are living in some of these states. So one person said, if I'm in public and I have to go to the bathroom, there's always that little bit of fear in the back of your head. Another person said, I'm a lot more hyper aware of my surroundings. My anxiety has gotten worse from just these bills being proposed. So you see here that even just the mere introduction or proposal of these policies is causing this kind of anticipatory anxiety and stress for individuals. And people talked about that a lot, the kind of feeling of always feeling like, when's the next shoe going to drop? We heard lots of stories about people feeling really isolated from these policies, feeling a tremendous sense of loneliness and even sense of abandonment in relation to these policies. So a lot of people talked about wanting to conceal their identities. So one person said, it's a matter of hiding who you are and not letting anyone know that you exist. People talked about kind of navigating the challenges of their identity concealment. I always feel a little otherness, a little wall between me and them. They can just exist, whereas I have to orchestrate and choreograph. So some folks that we spoke with talked about the fact that in order to protect themselves, they often have to sort of present differently in different spaces, and that's just a very, very intense thing to orchestrate and choreograph, and it takes time, and it also makes them feel kind of alienated from other people who don't have to experience that extra layer of stress and that burden. Another person said, I can't reconcile them, my parents, saying that they love me and also voting for policies that would make sure that people like me can't exist. That's been kind of painful. So lots of folks we spoke with really talked about feeling cut off from close friends, just from their friends or loved ones' beliefs, but also quite literally, we talked to one person who said that their kid could no longer play sports, and so they could no longer hang out with their friends. So kind of just all these cascading social isolating effects of these policies we really heard. And then, we spoke to lots of people that in the wake of these policies, people feeling really powerless and hopeless about the future because of these policies. So one person said, I feel like the future is quite bleak. It's kind of like, what's the point? The world, it's kind of falling apart. Like, what am I fighting for? What am I doing? And, even people that were really engaged in lots of advocacy talked about feeling kind of defeated and exhausted, that they felt like they were putting up a really good fight and that they were just feeling like barrier after barrier was really preventing them from feeling quite hopeful about the future. So one participant said, feeling, is it worth it? You've done all you can do. You mustered the whole army. You didn't have enough horses. I'm feeling battle fatigue. And as I mentioned, this was this kind of tension with the fact that, everyone that we spoke with said that they were really feeling the impacts of these policies, and at the same time that some are really impacted more than others. Lots of people talked about the fact that young people, and particularly trans and non-binary young people, are the most targeted by these policies, and so they're really feeling the impacts the most. So one person said, I know more than one trans friend who's basically just given up on even trying to achieve gender affirming care. There's too many obstacles in the way that it's just not feasible. And again, the kind of social and economic inequality compounding the impacts of these policies. So one participant said, my kids are both Black. There's this extra Southern layer of racism that comes with all of this, particularly for my trans girl. I'm not sure I ever fully feel safe when we're out and about. Another person said, I've seen a lot of people leave. It's the people of privilege that are leaving. And that's very frustrating to me. Who's going to help continue to fight? So kind of in response to that earlier question from before about, people moving, we did hear lots of folks say that people are leaving their states, but it's the people who have, the economic and financial means to leave their states that are leaving, kind of leaving behind the folks who can't afford to do so. People we spoke with also mentioned the fact that a lot of more progressive states have much higher costs of living. And so it's not necessarily feasible for some people to leave their communities. And lots of folks felt like it was unfair that they even had to make that decision between their home, their community, and feeling like they could access healthcare. And finally, rural communities really are more negatively impacted. We heard that a lot from folks. So, one person said, if my car breaks down out here a couple hours outside of Atlanta, am I going to be okay? So lots of people feeling like, is there safety if they're not in an urban area? So here's a QR code to the full paper so you can read some of the really powerful quotes from participants. I feel really privileged and fortunate that they were willing to share their stories with our team. Overall, from the study, we really learned that LGBTQIA people reported profound psychological distress due to these policies, and that there were lots of unequal impacts from these policies. So those directly targeted by these policies, like trans and non-binary people and youth, really experienced the most profound material and psychological impacts, and that these policies are amplified or lessened depending on people's access to social and economic resources and supportive communities. Um, but, just going back to that first slide around all the different tensions, just want to reiterate and underscore the fact that, the people that we spoke with are quite diverse, and the impacts of these policies were really heterogeneous and varied. So we saw lots of different tensions, not just that kind of hopelessness and despair and distress, but also hope and resilience. And lots of people shared stories of advocacy, and trying to combat these policies. So just some key takeaways from both of the studies. In that large scale quantitative study, we saw that anti-transgender state policies were associated with increased mental health symptoms among LGBTQIA adults. In our follow-up qualitative study, LGBTQIA people described the profound and unequal mental health impacts of these recent policies. But it's important to just underscore that LGBTQIA people are diverse and their experiences are diverse, and the impacts of these policies really are varied. And of course, we need policies to protect the rights and healthcare access of LGBTQIA people. So thank you again to the Pride study, to all the participants, community partners, to PrideNet for really making this work possible. I'm so grateful that people were willing to share their stories and tell us their truth. And I also just want to thank the wonderful collaborators, many of my students who were part of this study, and our funders and the institutional support that we received. So eager to hear your questions.
And thank you so much, Brianna. I think I just really deeply appreciate the approach of using both the quantitative and the qualitative. I feel like you provided such a rich and layered, I think, understanding of what is happening on so many different levels. I'm going to go ahead and move into the chat. There's a question. I am curious if you have any insights into what, if anything, people felt helped to buffer from the impact of these policies on their social and emotional well-being.
Yeah, that's such a great question. Definitely social support, so just having loved ones and community. I think, as much as we heard people feeling this kind of battle fatigue, as that participant shared, we also heard lots of people talking about how advocacy and a way of connecting with others was a way to not feel so isolated and alone. And just kind of feeling despair in light of these policies. So we definitely heard that. We also heard people engaging in lots of kind of active coping strategies, like, intentionally being really thoughtful about their engagement with the news, trying not to kind of like go down the kind of the doom scrolling spiral that can, that is totally understandable. And also they were really thoughtful about, how much it was actually helping them in terms of giving them information. So I think kind of active coping strategies, lots of community and support seeking from others. Those were some of the things that we heard the most.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. I know we have many more questions, but unfortunately, out of time. Maybe what we could do is, if you have the capacity, we could follow up with some of the questions and give some responses to folks after the webinar when we send out the recordings, etc.
Definitely. Thanks,
Great.
Al.
Well, please join me in throwing glitter, lots of snaps and applause. Light up the screen with your emojis for Dr. Brianna Last for that really impactful double feature. Thank you so much. All right. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome to the virtual stage someone that I know quite well as a former colleague, Dr. David Knitz. For a brief introduction, Dr. David Knitz recently completed a 2-year training with the Pride Study and is now assistant professor at The Ohio State University College of Social Work. David's research focuses on social factors that impact LGBTQI plus people's health, including issues like poverty and employment. Thank you so much for joining us today, David. Please feel free to introduce yourself, visual description, and go ahead and take us away.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm just going to quickly share my screen here, and I'll get a thumbs up from folks if that is correct, but I think we are good to go. I'm excited to share my research with you today. Thank you for those thumbs up. A little visual description of myself is I'm a white guy with short gray hair, salt and pepper facial hair, like bearded, wearing a blue polo shirt in front of a colorful picture in the background. I'm excited to share my research today with you around unfavorable stressors and experiences and how that relates to the employment quality or job quality among LGBTQIA plus workers. So as Daniel said, I study topics around employment and poverty and how they impact LGBTQIA plus people's health. And relevant to this topic, this study specifically, the topics of poor employment, minority stress, and unequal treatment all relate. So LGBTQIA plus people experience unemployment and work low-income jobs much more than the general population. So they have much poorer employment outcomes. Minority stress, which some people might be quite familiar with, is when people from marginalized communities experience stress due to discrimination and social exclusion and having to manage stigma on a daily basis. And so we all know that LGBTQIA plus people also face a lot of minority stress. And the third main topic, unequal treatment, is that LGBTQIA, that is a tongue twister. I might say queer and trans just to keep myself speaking smoother sometimes. But we face unfair treatment, such as experiences of discrimination related to identities at work and when applying for jobs. So these are the three topics I'll focus on mostly today. So given experiences of poor employment, minority stress, and unequal treatment, we ask the questions of what does job quality look like among LGBTQIA workers? And when I say job quality, I mean how good or bad someone's job is. So sometimes we know that employment itself is good, but at the same time, some of us might be in jobs that are good and pay fairly, full-time work, or we might be scraping together low-wage, short-term contract kind of jobs, or might be unemployed and looking for work. So I wanted to understand that spectrum of work and how that's impacted. So then we asked, what is the relationship between minority stress, unfair treatment, and job quality? And so to answer those questions, we combined participants from the 2021 and 2022 annual health questionnaires. So thank you for everybody on the call who has completed the annual questionnaires. We really aren't able to do this research without your participation. And participants were adults who we restricted the population to those who are active in the labor market. So that's anyone who is working or unemployed and was looking for work. And we know that everybody in the PRIDE study is LGBTQIA identified and that they participated in English. So combining years 2021 and 2022, we had 4,211 people in the study, and participants on average were aged 34 and predominantly white, US born, and lived in urban areas. There were a diversity of gender identities included, and we grouped participants based on their gender identity into the categories of cisgender men and women, gender diverse people assigned female at birth, and gender diverse people assigned male at birth. And we included sex assigned at birth due to the differences that these groups often face within workplace discrimination and in the labor market. And then the final groups were transgender men and women. So focusing on some high-level employment findings first is among almost 25% of participants were on unstable jobs. So that's the overall population, not defined by gender identity. So that means that 25% were in temporary part-time kind of work. And then 6.8% were unemployed, and almost half of them earned less than $50,000 a year. And now to focus on minority stress among the overall population. In the PRIDE study, the average level of minority stress, as Briana had said, is quite high, moderate to severe levels. And as well, that minority stress that people were experiencing was related to unstable jobs, unemployment, and earning less than $50,000 a year. So we did see an association or a relationship between minority stress and the poor employment outcomes. And we'll go into the gender breakdown after I introduce these topics. And so the third topic around unequal treatment, approximately 1 in 6 participants experienced unequal treatment. So that's like discrimination when applying for jobs or at work. And that unequal treatment was also related to being in unstable jobs. So thinking temporary part-time work, being unemployed or earning between $20,000 to $50,000 a year. So more on the lower end of income. And so, as I said, we did a bit more of a gender analysis with this study, and we found that trans and gender diverse workers reported more stress and unequal treatment compared to cisgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and queer workers. And they're also more commonly in unstable employment, unemployment, and had lower income. So overall, queer and trans people, or sorry, trans and gender diverse people had worse job quality than cisgender sexual minority people. And so since we saw those differences, trans and gender diverse people having worse outcomes, we wanted to see if there was also a difference in the relationship between minority stress and unfair treatment on the one side with job quality by gender identity. So first, looking at minority stress, the relationship between minority stress and work experiences and income was similar across the different gender groups. And I'll show you what this looks like in the next few slides. So I don't want us to get overwhelmed by all the results. So just focusing within the large, I'm going to say it's yellow. I'm a little bit colorblind, but I tried to use colors that I could see as well. We'll focus on the orange or yellow square. So for the numbers on the right, the higher they are, the stronger the relationship. That's what those numbers mean. So the strongest relationships we can see among those numbers are among cisgender men who have 1.5, gender diverse people assigned male at birth with 2.1, and trans men with 1.5. So based on the close number range going from 1.2 to 2.1, we can see that there's a similar relationship for each gender group, with the exception of trans women. We did not see that same level of relationship. And so I've set up these slides. We're going to have 4 slides that look quite similar. At the top of the square, I have a sentence where I'm hoping we can just plug in the numbers together. So where you see a Y, look at the Y column where it's around gender group. And then on the right side where you see an X, we're going to fill in the number. So we'll use cisgender men as the example. So we can say cisgender men with higher minority stress scores were 1.5 times more likely to be unemployed. And so we can say that again. We'll look at gender diverse AMAB people. So gender diverse AMAB people with higher minority stress scores were 2.1 times more likely to be unemployed. So there's a strong relationship for the most part, between higher minority stress scores and people's unemployment. And I have a little yellow box around the results for cisgender men. And that's because this result was statistically significant, which is a term that I saw Briana use as well. And that means that we can be more confident with these findings than we can the other findings. So we see a relationship with the other findings, but they aren't necessarily statistically significant. And so now looking at the relationship between minority stress and income being earning less than $20,000. And using the same structure, we can also see that the relationship was relatively similar across the different gender groups, with the exception again of trans women. And so based on the yellow rectangles, the ones that have the most confidence are cisgender men, gender diverse AMAB people, and transgender men. And so we can see that gender diverse assigned male at birth people had the strongest relationship. And so using the sentence at the top of the square again, gender diverse AMAB people with higher minority stress scores were 2.8 times more likely to report income below $20,000 a year. So I'm hoping this makes sense, but we can dive into it more in the Q&A as well. And so we talked about minority stress and now looking at unequal treatment. So that's workplace discrimination or discrimination when applying for jobs. Interestingly, we saw the similarities between minority stress and gender groups, but the relationship was different across different gender groups when it came to unequal treatment and people's work outcomes. So we can see this in the table here. The relationship was only significant again for cisgender men, though we also see a relatively strong relationship for other gender groups, and this time it includes trans women. So such as gender diverse people assigned male at birth, as well as trans women. So using the fill in the blank sentence again, we can say that cisgender men who reported unfair treatment were 6.9 times more likely to be unemployed than those who did not experience unfair treatment. And then again, just hoping I have some time, I will say gender diverse people assigned male at birth who reported unfair treatment were 4.1 times more likely to be unemployed than those who did not experience unfair treatment. And similarly, those who reported unfair treatment, such as cisgender men, were the only statistically significant one here. We saw 2.3 times more likely to report income below $20,000. So though these associations did not reach statistical significance, there's a clear pattern in the data that show a relationship for most gender groups. So you can see here for gender diverse people assigned male at birth is 2.4, and transgender men 2, and transgender women 2.7 times more likely to earn below $20,000 if they experience workplace discrimination or unfair treatment. So given all that, what should we do about these results is that these issues require multiple sources of intervention, both at the society level, so more structural level issues need to be addressed to reduce minority stress among LGBTQIA plus people. So similar to Briana's, we need to address more of those social policies and things like that to reduce minority stress for queer and trans people, as well as address discrimination in hiring and on the job for LGBTQIA workers. And hopefully that will improve employment and income for queer and trans workers. But this is not a causality study. This was a cross-sectional study. So we aren't able to say exactly that there's a cause and effect through these results. But if what I presented was a bit blurry, I realize I presented a lot of numbers at the same time and talk relatively fast. I have 4 key takeaways to talk to you about today. And the first is that LGBTQIA workers face high levels of minority stress and unequal treatment, so discrimination, and that's especially for for trans and gender diverse workers. Trans and gender diverse workers also have more unemployment and lower incomes than their cisgender counterparts. And minority stress and unequal treatment are related to unstable employment, unemployment, and lower incomes. And so despite laws and protections in the workplace, labor markets, social attitudes and behaviors negatively impact LGBTQIA workers' employment outcomes still. And if you want to do a deep dive into the methods and results of this study that I didn't get to talk about too much in this presentation, you can find it published online. I believe Elle might have posted something in the chat with a link, but it's titled The Associations of Minority Stress and Employment Discrimination with Job Quality Among Sexual and Gender Minority Workers. And you might think it's weird that I published this in a Scandinavian journal, but this is one of the leading international work and health journals, and they had never previously published LGBTQIA research, and they have a very broad readership. So I wanted us to not be speaking to the choir, wanted to really get this out to the public audience of work and health scholars. And with that, I will say thank you, and I look forward to comments. And you can email me if we don't have time for questions today. Thank you so much to Pride Study participants for participating, as well as my collaborators, Win, Faraz, Mika, Joelle, Juno, Anissa, Mitch, and Donna Rockstad, who supported my training with the Pride Study.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, David. And I want to also lift up some praise you're getting in the chat as well as for Briana. Someone shared, I just want to say I appreciate the A+ science communication happening in this webinar. The researchers are doing such a great job of discussing this in a way that makes sense easily. So I second and third that. You all are amazing, and thank you so much for taking the time and energy and being here to create the space to share and build more bridges between our researchers, our community members, our participants, etc. I'll go ahead and dive into, there is a question in the chat. So someone shared the size of impact for trans women of unfair treatment on income was larger than for cis men, but was not statistically significant. Why would that be?
Great question. You'll see I had Win on the team as well, who is the biostatistician with the Pride study, and he was the rock for the quantitative analysis. But I will give my primarily qualitative researcher response. And I think that's because in our sample, a lot of the trans women were retired already. So there weren't as many trans women, so the numbers might have been smaller. And oftentimes there might be a strong relationship, but we just can't have as much confidence in the numbers when there are fewer people who are participating in the study. There are various reasons why the confidence intervals, I didn't present those on the screen just because there's already so much information, but oftentimes it's due to limited numbers of people. So we would likely see more strength in that relationship if there were more trans women included in this study. But for this study specifically, among the working population, trans women were older, so they might have had other situations than other workers. We saw that among trans women, and then as well, more trans women were retired already. But that's going to be my response for that. Thanks for that question, though.
Yeah, great question. Thanks so much, David. I'll share a comment before moving to the question. Someone shared your avatar is oddly accurate. I agree. I love it. I'll go ahead and move to the next question. It's somewhat similar in looking at the different groups, so gender groups and impact. So someone shared, I was surprised to see cisgender men so impacted. Given gender discrimination and male privilege, I would have guessed cisgender men would be least impacted. What do you make of this, or am I misunderstanding the data?
So you're not misunderstanding the data, but I think it also is something that showed up in Briana's, and I think it shows up in a lot of Pride study data that some of the experiences of our trans and gender diverse participants, they're already facing a lot more minority stress. So there is a lot of privilege oftentimes among the cisgender group. That could be that experiences of discrimination might hit more because they're not experiencing it as much in everyday life, where for the this is just off the top of my head as someone who's researching these things, so these are not factual by any stretch, but I could imagine that trans and diverse people face a lot more discrimination, even on the subway getting to work, than they do just in the workplace itself. So it might not be having the same amount of impact in the workplace, where cis men might be able to walk to work without discrimination, and when they're experiencing it at work, it's making a big impact. So it's just oftentimes there's already a heavy burden on trans and gender diverse people outside of the workplace that sometimes we're not seeing as much of an impact in these specific areas that we're looking at because there's already a heavy burden, which I think is similar to what Brianna's presentation was saying as well.
Yeah,
But
thanks so
these
much
are
for
good
those
questions and methods
reflections.
questions too.
Yeah, yeah. And then I'm going to move us into our last question from the audience. Do you have any reason to believe that some genders might internalize or minimize stigma rather than believe they were mistreated?
Hmm. That's a very insightful question, the one that I'm going to have to think about. Can you repeat that, Daniel?
Yeah, no problem.
I'm happy to
So,
chat about that too. Maybe that's something we can all think. I think Brianna probably has some thoughts too. Maybe that's a really good group discussion question.
I
yeah,
love
yeah.
that. Thanks for
Would
the
would
save, Nick.
Yeah, would open it up. Please feel free, Nick, Brianna, if you have any insights, feel free to come off camera or stay off camera and share. The question was, do you have any reason to believe that some genders might internalize or minimize stigma rather than believe they were mistreated?
The reason this is the top of my mind at the moment is because I just worked with a mentee on a pretty extensive qualitative data collection effort among transgender women in Vietnam. And one of the main um, conclusions from that study was that transgender women in that particular sample didn't actively chose to not see certain types of violence and discrimination as such, and really leaned into their resilience as a way of buffering the stigma that they would normally experience from society more broadly. And so when you ask somebody questions about that, they may not endorse it as violence, discrimination, or minority stress because they're like, well, yeah, it happens to everybody. And like, we just get on with it. That's what we do. So there may be some of that at play. Whereas those in more privileged positions would feel more slighted uh, when experiencing a specific type of minority stress.
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question, like um, how you make attributions, so what do you um, understand to be like the source of your challenges? And I think that that's where like it's so important to be multi-method, like David and Nick are, and we're all trying to sort of work to kind of triangulate evidence and think about, okay, we see this association between policies and mental health symptoms, but then what do people say about the policies themselves? And like just looking at the sort of differences. And I don't think that um, I don't have a priori hypotheses about like which direction that's going to go always. But I think it's so important to kind of get that diversity of measures and methods to really understand the differences between sort of how people attribute the sources of their distress versus like what we can understand also as like objective sources of distress, and like looking at that kind of variation in experience.
Yeah, and there's so much cultural aspect to it as well. Like, I don't want to say that this gender group does this differently because this gender group with these other characteristics, whether they're cultural or otherwise, might totally internalize different experiences differently. So it's a very tough question. I'm also like, you've got a social worker, you've got a psychologist. I think, Nick, you're a nurse. Very different perspectives on the team, but yeah, it's a tough question to answer, but it's a very good question.
Yeah, well, I want to say thank you to everyone, to Nick and to Brianna and David for answering that question. Thanks, Nick. I think this was a great group moment to have a discussion and give these different perspectives. I do want to invite everyone to join me in giving a big round of applause, throwing a lot of glitter. Let's light up the Zoom screen with all the emojis that you can find. Thank you so much, David, for all the work that you do and for being here to present with us. We appreciate you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you, everybody.
Great. Well, I think this is a great segue for me to go ahead and introduce our last presentation. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Dr. Nick Matheny. So as a brief introduction, Dr. Nick Matheny is a nurse scientist and assistant professor at Emory University who works alongside communities in the United States and South Africa to prevent intimate partner violence and support survivors' health, safety, and long-term stability. His work partners with academics, advocates, and local organizations to strengthen care, expand access to services, and address the social and structural conditions that allow violence to persist. Thank you so much for being here with us, Nick. Please feel free to introduce yourself, provide a brief visual description, and move into the presentation.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here today. I'm Nick Matheny. I use he, him pronouns, and I am a white guy with short black hair and wearing a blue polo and currently a very stuffy nose. So apologies for that in advance.
I want to talk to you today about intimate partner violence and its effect on substance use among people in the PRIDE study. So, trigger warning, this does go over some examples of and instances of intimate partner violence, including physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. So just take care while listening. So a research question here was, what is the relationship between past year intimate partner violence and substance use in the next year among PRIDE study participants of all genders and sexualities? And before we get into the methods and results of the study, I think it's important to make sure we have a shared understanding of what intimate partner violence is. It's defined by the World Health Organization as any action within a romantic relationship that causes physical, sexual, or emotional harm. Um, the way that it's operationalized is very often heteronormative and cisgender. And so that means that there are forms of violence that exist within queer relationships that are not well represented in the instruments and measures that we use to look at intimate partner violence, which is a major gap that I and lots of other people are trying to narrow. But just keep in mind that the forms of violence that we discuss here were created for a population that is different than the PRIDE study population. We do know, however, that intimate partner violence is pretty high in LGBTQIA plus folks. Oftentimes, it's thought to be higher than in cisgender or heterosexual women, just because the rates using those measures are about the same, but they don't take into account the types of violence that occur only in queer relationships that may not be picked up by those measures. And so there are some pretty extensive global studies that we published in The Lancet and in Nature that show that intimate partner violence does lead to negative health outcomes and is responsible for an appreciable fraction of all of these negative health outcomes. You can see on the bottom left that drug use disorders is one of them. And all of these are likely related in some way to experiencing chronic stress, kind of like the minority stress that David was talking about. But the stress of experiencing intimate partner violence and feeling unsafe in your own relationship can add to other types of chronic stress, increasing the risk for these types of negative health outcomes. We're focusing specifically on drug use disorders in this study, but we did publish a similar study last year on alcohol use among LGBTQIA folks using the PRIDE study. Because we're really trying to, again, close the gap between what we know about IPV and health outcomes in the broader population and in LGBTQIA plus folks specifically. We also know that LGBTQIA plus folks use substances at higher rates than the general population. In recent studies of LGBTQIA folks in the US, looking only at cisgender sexual minority folks, they did find that illicit drug use and then all of the other drugs listed below that on the right side of that graph were higher in sexual minority communities than in sexual majority communities, and that those differences persist over the life course. So this isn't something that people are experimenting with in their youth, let's say, and then it trails off as they get older. You can see on the bottom left side of the screen that sexual minority folks have higher rates of substance use across the life course and across sex assigned at birth. We don't have great population-based estimates of gender minority folks, but again, that's something that we're working to change. So there are two possible ways that we think substance use and intimate partner violence can be related. And they both stem from a minority stress framework. But the first is that someone is under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both, and then becomes violent towards their partner. This is the classic example of like a 1950s movie where the father comes home drunk or whatever, and then, physically assaults his wife or children. That happens, and it's certainly a big issue. But we also think that the stress of experiencing intimate partner violence can lead to higher rates of substance use among people simply for that reason I was talking about earlier, which is the exposure to chronic stress over a longer period of time. And so we tried to control for the first pathway, and look at the second pathway to understand how we can look at intimate partner violence as one modifiable factor in treating substance use in LGBTQIA folks. So what we did in this study is we took about 3,800 Pride Study participants. Thank you again to all of the participants who provide their data. It really is changing what we know about the health of our communities, and that's invaluable. We looked at intimate partner violence exposure in 2021, and then we took those same people and looked at their substance use in 2022, which means that we were able to look what's called temporally at the relationship between violence and substance use. So we know that the violence occurred within the 12 months up to 2021, and that the substance use was asking about substance use in 2022. So there wasn't much overlap between exposure to violence and the use of substances, which means we can say that the violence was associated with substance use in a temporal way. We controlled for all of those things in the green box, which attempts to look at all of the other ways that intimate partner violence and these other things can affect substance use. And so if we control for those things, then we know it's not those. It could be something else we didn't look at, but it's more likely to be the substance use that's causing the change than age, gender ID, orientation, etc. We looked at two different kinds of substance use. We looked at any recent substance use of any substance within the past 30 days. And then we looked at something called substance involvement score, which was how negatively the use of that substance impacts the person's daily life. What we found was pretty consistent with other estimates of illicit substance use among LGBTQIA folks in other studies, and that's that about 1 in 4 or about 3 in 5 participants reported substance use in the past year, so about 37% of people. And about 1 in 4 participants, or 25% of people, experienced intimate partner violence in the past 12 months, which is a really high incidence rate. 24% of people experienced emotional abuse, which was the most common type of violence experienced by folks. Again, this is a screener that was designed specifically for cisgender heterosexual women, but the language and gendered nature of the instrument was altered so it could be used in the Pride study. What we found when we did that analysis that I went through a minute ago was that overall the mean substance involvement scores were low, which tells us that people use substances regularly, but they don't negatively impact their lives too much, which is a good thing. But those substance involvement scores were significantly higher if the person had been exposed to intimate partner violence in the year prior. The largest difference was in cannabis use, but we saw significant differences in all 7 of the categories of substances that we looked at: cannabis, stimulants, hallucinogens, opiates, sedatives, and inhalants. We also saw that experiencing intimate partner violence in 2021 was directly responsible for more substance use in 2022. This was true for intimate partner violence overall, meaning the physical, sexual, or emotional abuse of any kind, and it was significant for physical abuse and emotional abuse, but not for sexual abuse. Now, this is the opposite of what we found in our alcohol use study, and we think that this is a aberration of statistics and not a true finding, because the prevalence rate, or the number of people who endorsed sexual abuse in this particular sample, was quite low. And so we think that's probably why that wasn't significant, rather than it actually not making a difference. But in the bold text, you can see that experiencing any form of violence in 2021 was associated with an 11% greater risk of substance use in 2022. And that was true of physical and emotional violence individually. Experiencing physical IPV in 2021 led to a 25% higher risk of substance use in 2022, and emotional violence was at 11% again. Looking at substance involvement scores, we also found that experiencing any form of IPV in 2021 was associated with a cannabis substance involvement score that was on average about a point higher than those that didn't experience intimate partner violence. And IPV was also associated with increases in stimulant scores, hallucinogen scores, and opiate scores, which means that not only are people choosing to use substances more if they've experienced violence, they're choosing to use the particular substance of choice more often, and it's negatively impacting their life more than it would if they didn't experience intimate partner violence. We were also able to look at the frequency of intimate partner violence. So we didn't just look at whether or not you experienced IPV, we looked at how often you experienced it over the past year. And so each additional point on that intimate partner violence scale was associated with an additional 0.22 points on the cannabis substance involvement scale. And that same pattern held for stimulants, hallucinogens, and opiates, which again means that this theory that the chronic stress experienced by those who are in violent relationships leads them to potentially choose coping mechanisms like substance use that can help reduce stress in the short term, but may not be good for their health in the long term. Some strengths of this study were similar to other Pride study analyses. We have a really diverse sample by geography and LGBTQIA plus identity. I didn't choose to present the breakdown of this by sexual orientation and gender identity, but we do have that data and we have it for our alcohol study as well. So I'm happy to send that if you like. One of the main strengths of this was that we looked at this over time. So we looked at the same people who took the survey in 2021 and 2022, so that we actually have two data points for those same participants. And we used pretty robust statistical methods to make sure that it was intimate partner violence that was making an impact on substance use over time. Some limitations. Again, I've spoken about the measurement of IPV. It's not great. It's about as good as we have for a survey like the Pride study, but again, we're probably missing some forms of violence that occur in relationships in our communities that don't occur in cisgender heterosexual relationships. There's less racial and ethnic diversity in the Pride study than I think all of us would like. And there are high levels of substance use, but low levels of substance involvement overall, which means that the differences we see are pretty minimal. But that's also a good thing. That means people aren't using a ton of drugs. So what did we learn? We learned that there is a significant impact of IPV on substance use in LGBTQIA plus communities, and that both rates of substance use and IPV are significant. So 25% of respondents experiencing recent intimate partner violence is a pretty significant finding. Usually those prevalence or incidence rates rather are on the magnitude of 8 to 12%. So 25% means that this is a pretty big deal for our community. And this means that intimate partner violence really should be considered as one factor that can alter the clinical approach to substance use education and treatment. And as far as I know, and from what I've read, the integration of intimate partner violence, healing modalities, counseling, and IPV related content in substance use services for LGBTQIA folks is really limited. And so this tells us that we really need to work on including IPV content in how LGBTQIA plus people are being treated for substance use disorder, as well as making sure that that is well known that experiencing partner violence and being in a violent relationship can lead to negative health impacts. This also tells us that reducing intimate partner violence in our communities through relationship education, gender norms change, and public awareness can also help reduce substance use for people in our communities. So here's a QR code for the entire paper. It's in the Annals of Behavioral Medicine. There's the full citation there in case it's helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Nick. And I did want to just make a mention. I was in preparing for this, I was looking at our webinar series last year, and it's literally a year to the day from when you presented last year on your previous study to Pride Study Wrap. So thank you so much for your continued commitment to sharing back your impactful research with our communities. I'll go ahead and move to the questions. So one person asked, Was the IPV scale the conflict tactics scale or another type of measurement?
Someone knows what they're talking about. That's good. So the conflict tactics scale is the sort of gold standard measure of intimate partner violence. And I guess news alert, we created it's under review now, the LGBTQIA adapted version of the conflict tactics scale. And so once that is ready for use, I'm hoping that we can integrate it into the Pride study because what we use is something called a full scale. It's a screener. And so it tells you whether someone has experienced IPV, but doesn't tell you a lot about the typology or why or how often. So it's a pretty short scale.
Thank you so much. And there was a request for the QR code. Elle, if you wouldn't mind just dropping, we have the link to the articles that we're putting in the chat. We've also included them for all of the studies today. And so if you wouldn't mind just dropping in the chat as well, that would be great. And we'll make sure to share that with everybody. Um, the last question that I'll ask is from the Q&A. Someone shares, it may be obvious, but I gather we're talking about victims of IPV and not perpetrators. Yes. Do any participants identify as perpetrators? If so, are these tracked differently in your work?
This is so important. I'm so glad you raised this. So in LGBTQIA plus communities, it's even more important to measure both victimization and perpetration of violence because in our community, something called bidirectional IPV, where both people in the relationship are perpetrating violence of some kind, is much more common than in cisgender heterosexual relationships. And so because the Pride survey is already pretty long, we don't get to ask about perpetration, but it's something that I'm actively working with the leaders of the Pride study on now. And I am really hoping that we can start asking those questions because you're right. Being a perpetrator of violence doesn't necessarily vilify someone. Rather, it is probably a reflection of their own trauma, substance use, alcohol use, or all of the above. And so I think it's really important to get a handle on who's also perpetrating violence so we can create interventions for those folks as well. Oh, I think you're muted, Daniel.
Sorry about that. Probably we're like, why are all these hand movements going on? It's my Italian side coming out, talking with my hands. So I want to invite everyone to um, uh, join me in thanking Nick for being here today, for sharing this really important research. Let's go ahead and light up the screen with emojis, throw glitter, snaps. So thank you so much, Nick. Really appreciate it. All right, so we're just about at the end. I'm going to go ahead and close us out real quickly. So we have a quick poll that we would like for you to go ahead and answer for us. Elle, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead and launching that poll. It wouldn't be a Pride Study event or activity if there wasn't some type of survey or some type of poll included, but this should only take about 30 seconds. It's or a minute. It's a quick six question, and it really helps us to understand the impact that these webinars are having, if we should continue, if there's ways that we can improve. So thanks so much for taking a few minutes to answer the polls. And as we close up, just wanted to remind you that we have the Pride Study wrapped. This is day one that just concluded. We have days 2 and 3 coming up this Thursday and Friday. If you haven't registered, please make sure that you do. And then we also invite you to stay connected with us. We have multiple ways that you can stay connected. We are on social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook, X, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, YouTube. For the most part, we're at the Pride Study. You can also make sure to sign up for our newsletter. You'll get updates when we have new research, such as the ones that are presented today, other activities. The link is in the chat, as well as this QR code to sign up for our newsletter. Also invited to contact us through our email address, pridenetconnect@stanford.edu. And lastly, really importantly, this is an invitation and a call to get involved with the Pride study. If you're not already a participant, consider learning more, and you can go ahead and scan the QR code as well as the links that Elle is going to drop in the chat for how you can become a participant in the Pride study. You can also collaborate with us on research, like the many amazing investigators, as well as the ones that were so kind to be here with us today. So there's more information on that QR code and link on how you can collaborate with the Pride study. And lastly, if you want to support LGBTQIA plus health research to persist and to continue, consider a donation to the Pride Study, tax deductible. There's also our link to pridestudy.org donate and our QR code. Huge thanks, everyone, for being in community with us today. Many thanks to our presenters today, and huge thanks to our PrideNet network, our participants, for making this work possible. We appreciate you all. We'll keep the screen up for a few more minutes. I know we're right at time, so we understand if you have to leave, but we'll also keep the polls up as well. Thank you so much, everyone. We appreciate you.